Well, howdy there, folks. James, Political Friar, coming to you again. I have the White Sox hat on, and so we're going to have a topic which is at least mostly history, but it really is driven off of current events. It's a topic that I've really ground on a lot recently, and that's how everyone can be so pessimistic and down on everything when the economy is actually really, really good. By every traditional measure, Americans are more prosperous now than they were 4 years ago. They're more prosperous now than they were at any time during the 2010s. Uh, Real income is up, inflation is now down, and the GDP is growing faster than it has since the 80s. So, why? Why is everybody in such a bad mood? Here's some of the metrics that exist in today's economy, just to get you a grounding in what I'm talking about. GDP in the third quarter grew by 5.2% annualized. That's better than twice as fast as our normal GDP growth target of 2%. Unemployment is at 3.7%. It hasn't been that low since the 50s. Workforce participation is 62.8%, which is about the same as 2015, a little lower than its peaks, but not at all bad. Uh, in 2019, the median income for an American family was $47,812. It's 57,406. That's only 4 years. Well, five, I guess, if you're talking about the beginning of the year. That's a 20% increase almost. That's a huge amount more money that Americans have as their median income. People are making a ton more money. Inflation topped out at 8% in 2022, but in 2023 it was 3% and trending down. How? How is it that people can say that the American economy is on the wrong track? How is it that people can be so pessimistic about the country's prospect? How is it that there can be such doom and gloom and pessimism out there in the world? And to answer that question, I went to history. I went to try to find, hey, history doesn't repeat itself, but as Margaret Millen has said, it sometimes rhymes. Well, have there been any times in American history which have been at all similar in the disconnect between the actual economic reality and the sentiment of the population? And I found two really good examples in the 20th century, and one that is not terrible in the 20th century. So I am limited a bit to the 20th century because we just don't have economic data before about 1913. That's where we started getting the Federal Reserve actually engaged in keeping these statistics. And so I'm sure that this has happened before then, but these are the stories that I want to tell of when the American population has been so pessimistic while the news has been so good. So, in 1920, the inflation rate was up to 15%. But we understand that in 1920, we were about to kick off a decade of economic growth and improvement that would earn the title the Roaring Twenties. And it wasn't until a financial crisis that wild economic growth, low inflation, high unemployment, increasing wages would end. But in 1920, the American population was deeply distressed at the rising prices that were driven by the expenditures of World War One. So distressed that despite all of the peace dividend that was coming their way and the economic boom that would follow the loss of market share of Germany in particular, but Russia too in the international markets, the American people just couldn't see the bright sun on the horizon, and they tossed the Democrats out and elected the Republicans. The Republicans wisely didn't do anything to ruin their success that came in the 1920s, but they also didn't really do anything to earn it. It was just the circumstances of the time. But why did the American people feel so pessimistic about their prospects in 1920? It's when inflation spiked. And it was after a long time, a long period of low inflation. All the data that we have, which really isn't all that much, showed that from 1913 to 1920, inflation was very low. It was only in 1917, when the Americans entered the war, that inflation started to rise, and it topped out in 1919, and then dropped to almost nothing after the crisis was averted, or I guess victory came. The next time that we have a similar disconnect between consumer sentiment and the economic reality is in 1947. See, 1947, 1948, inflation rose to 14%. It was a hangover from the expenditures of World War II. You had supply chain disruption as the economy transitioned from building guns to butter. And so you end up with supply chain shortages and increased demand from millions of people coming back from overseas, and that causes prices to go up. Inflation topped out, but it also caused a huge amount of economic growth. And by 1950, inflation was zero and the GDP was growing as fast as it would during the 20th century. Prices during the 30s were obviously extremely stable, if not deflationary. And during the 40s, until the war got started, they were pretty stable too. And so you again had this expectation of price stability that was interrupted by events, external events, world events, history, for lack of a better word, that caused inflation to spike and caused consumers to freak out, despite the fact that the economy was about to take off on only its second huge boom of the 20th century following the 1920s. So the 1950s and the 1920s were both preceded by times of extreme economic anxiety and extreme economic good news. Yeah, maybe you're guessing at the next one, 1980. 1980, inflation topped out at 13%. And this was caused by a combination of Vietnam War expenditures and, frankly, just terrible monetary policy during the Nixon administration. Though that external shock to the economy of the war, and I guess actually a little less external with Nixon's monetary policy being so inflationary, caused a period of low inflation to be interrupted by a spike in inflation. See, during the 50s and 60s and early 70s, inflation was at near zero, 1% or so. And then you have a shock of a inflationary cycle. Between 1978 and 1983, you ended up with double-digit inflation every year. And that is one of the most prolonged inflationary periods that we have any data for, and it caused a similar political backlash. Jimmy Carter suffered massively from inflation that was arguably caused by Nixon, but the president in the chair is the one who gets the blame. And so today we have another pattern. We had the pandemic that caused massive supply chain interruptions, a reorganizing of the economy, and inflation. Inflation caused by both a supply chain issue, both getting products where they're going, and a change in demand, people demanding more things than services just because they're locked down. And so prices went up. Prices also went up because you had a huge amount of government money coming into the system to keep wealth from being destroyed based on people not being able to go back to work or selling businesses or things like that. So the relief efforts contributed to inflation too, but this inflation spike appears to be over. And with all of the good other economic indicators, the question is, why are people still apparently freaking out? And I think it's because they've suffered the trauma of an inflationary spike. But what does this tell us about what we might expect in years coming? Well, as long as we don't get in our own way, it's probably good news. Anyway, it's just a thought Tell me how wrong I am in the comments down below. Leave me a like, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and just know that I really appreciate you. Thanks.